except that Locke was a little bit more socialist than they because of the Lockean provisos and so forth. And the reason you have to have that is if you start tying top down, which is the way Jed describes it, it not only works great in a democracy where everybody votes somebody else out through faction, but it also, the Lockean conception was designed to oppose divine rights and power, where the king received it from the Lord, who could then devote it as he will. So there is no variation with respect to this. And when you start dealing with intellectual property, we're having another panel later, but the whole theory of intellectual property is that the state has some power to figure out how you abridge the normal rights to speech and to use particular things in the hope to create Pareto improvements. But the protection of property doesn't come in the creation of the system, which has some degree of debate about it, although its parameters can be well established. It comes in the question is after you've decided to create an indefeasible grant, can you then double-cross people and take back what you've given? And I think under that one, the instability of right arguments that you make with respect to land carry over. So there are differences in the origin of intellectual property, but nobody has ever denied them. That's why when you look at the copyright and patent clause under the Constitution, they talk about them as legislative creations, but they have a clear conception of how it is that this is supposed to be done. So I think the natural rights conception has always had a component of equality. Anybody could acquire property through a first possession rule, but the equality conception doesn't have any component of property rights in it and is consistent with the most totalitarian and arbitrary of regimes. And as Simon Perez said a long time ago, the friends of liberty always do better by equality than the friends of equality do by liberty. And once we understand that, we will understand why it is, again, that when you want to get a comprehensive understanding of property, you don't want to be at the Yale Law School.
Let me just may I just reply just very briefly? Well, when you don't have an argument, you bring up the name of Yale Law School. It's interesting. But now listen, really, I mean, you really need to be a little cautious about arguments from nature. I mean, you must, surely everybody understands that. I mean, when men kept women out of jobs, they said that was a matter of natural law. When fundamentalist Islam says Sharia, they think their law is natural law. And they can be up, they will have their arguments about history with Professor Epstein, and they'll say ours is natural law. He'll say what he believes in is natural law. Really, is that argument going to be the one that determines what our law in our country is going to be? No. We determine what our law is through self-government and democracy, checked by the Constitution, which itself was a democratic product. It's not done through arguments about...
Democratic? It was a republic. Completely different system.
You'll get...
Every time he touches me, you know he's made another mistake.
I want to bring Steve into the conversation here and switch around a little bit. Steve, I'm interested in your view of the judicial system today as it relates to what you've been talking about in terms of incentives. You're from a businessman's perspective, do you think the courts today are really enhancing the operation of incentives and choices by providing a stable system for business expectations? Or in your view, of the way the court's operating today, a real impediment to allowing a system of incentive and choice to work to maximum effect? Is it possible to make a generalization from a business perspective as to the contribution courts are or not making to this whole area?
Well, as you know, many times, not many, but often courts exhibit no more understanding of true economics, true entrepreneurial capitalism than some people in this room today. And you're accepted. But you look at things like the Kelo decision, shows they have sometimes an imperfect understanding of basic property rights and takings. In the 1930s, after they got browbeaten by the New Deal, started to make decisions that went against in terms of enabling markets to truly function. The last great decision was throwing out the NRA in 1935, which was as close as we got to a corporatist state in our history, all done with the best of intentions. And in recent times, the courts have not stood up to abrogation of contract law. Certainly with the GM and Chrysler bankruptcies, there are established procedures on what to do with companies that get in trouble. Every major airline in the country has gone through, except American Airlines, has gone through reorganization. Doesn't mean you cease to exist, but by law, you make those adjustments, and then you try and go out and do it again. And but that has been abrogated. And one of the things that's hurting the housing market is that the Treasury Department's been allowed to get away with muddying where you stand if something goes wrong with a house, first mortgage, second mortgage, home equity loan. The banks are hopelessly compromised on that. And so who's going to buy, other than the Federal Reserve, a mortgage-backed security? No private investor will, because you don't know where you stand in terms of ranking, in terms of being a creditor. So the courts, I think, I'm not an activist, but in certain areas where the politicians have gone too far, the courts should, in the economic side, learn to push back. But so far, I've not seen signs of it. Maybe Richard would.
They're
Let's
hopeless.
have a question over here.
This question is for Andrew Stern. Andrew, you made an analysis based about the relationship of where we're going economically in terms of your productivity and wages and the divergence that took place between those. In light of that, could you comment on what you think happened with regard to unions and the automobile industry during that same period?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that unions miss the most, basic fundamental economic role that they have to play, which is to take wages out of competition. And, what happened is when they had a monopoly or took wages out of competition for the big three, people competed, much more on efficiency and quality, not very good, but that was what's the basis of the competition. And then when the transplants came and the market changed, the competition really, changed, and the union didn't do its job, which was it was an anchor to its employers in the competitive field as opposed to a help. And I think, unions, like I'd say some people on this panel, kind of, miss the basic role of what unions should do in a perfect world, and I guess, which is, to try to find a non-governmental way to share in success. And as much as people might say it was the best anti-poverty program that ever worked in America that didn't cost the government a dime, and clearly when the world changed to be a global economy, it missed its moment of what its new role had to be. But if you find a janitor in New York City in any one of Steve Forbes' buildings, they make a very good salary and very good wages, and the competition is all about quality and efficiency and not who can pay the people the least.
Yes, no.
All right, sir.
Oh, we can't answer?
Mr. Stern, I'd just like to point out that recent wage gains have in fact gone to covering the increasing costs of health care. And so if you were to implement the kind of free market reforms that would constrain the cost of health care, you could resume the coupling of productivity and wage growth. Would that not take much of the steam out of your argument?
No, because I don't, there's actually less people, I believe, covered percentage-wise by healthcare now than there was when things were coupled and not decoupled. There were more people with pensions when things were coupled, and as opposed to now when they're decoupled. So yes, the price of healthcare is obviously affecting people's wage increases, but the truth is the inequality is still growing. The rising tide is raising the luxury liners, and the rest of the boats are not seen or raised. They're in choppy waters.